"Please, Mr. Aldrich, do not go upstairs." I begged him, and my voice cracked like glass. The rain outside pounded the driveway, and his black shoes left dark crescents on the marble steps. Victor Aldridge stood at the bottom of the stairwell of his Fifth Avenue townhouse, his suit jacket half buttoned, a suitcase forgotten at his feet. Rosa Morales, the housekeeper who had worked for his family for 9 years, pressed both palms to the banister as if holding the house itself in place. Her eyes were rimmed with salt, and she smelled of lemon cleaner and cold coffee. He looked at her as if he could not recognize her, as if loyalty and profit had carved deep grooves between them. He moved toward the stair, and she stepped in front, breath sharp, nails white on the wood. "You cannot go up there," she said. "Please, sir, do not do this." He looked away, and the house hummed with an air conditioner, the soft tick of an antique clock, the scent of jasmine from a vase in the foyer. Upstairs, behind a closed door, a truth waited that would tear the world Victor believed apart. He was a billionaire, and that meant the world expected him to be invincible. She was the housekeeper, and that meant she was supposed to be invisible. New York, midnight. The relationship between them had always been functional, threaded with scheduling apps and a list of duties. Now, on a slick night when the city lights blinked through rain, their roles reversed into something precarious. Victor, the man whose face opened newspapers, wore a mask of polite exhaustion. Rosa, who had scrubbed the grout between his marble tiles and folded his shirts with a tenderness she kept private, trembled with a loyalty that had nothing to do with money. The scent of lemon rose as if the house itself was trying to cleanse a stain. Sirens sounded faint and distant, like a forecast from another life. She had been there the morning his mother died, there the afternoon his first company collapsed, there the night he signed papers that changed hundreds of lives. He had once whispered a promise to the woman who ironed his shirts with a patience born of her grandmother's kitchen, the promise that he would protect his family. Now the promise showed cracks. He fumbled with his keys, and the metallic click rang like a verdict. Rosa braced herself, knuckles tight, and for a moment time fractured. The hum of the refrigerator a single note under everything. He pushed past her, cold rain seeping from his collar, and the chain of events began to unspool. Inside the bedroom, the windows were steamed with the city's breath. A lamp burned beside the bed, and a single shoe lay on the floor as if someone had got up and not finished the act of leaving. The mattress bore an indentation that did not belong to Victor. There was a perfume on the sheets, something floral but metallic, like a chemical memory. Victor threw open a closet and a door that led to a small private study. On the desk lay an envelope, thick, with handwriting he did not recognize. Victor grabbed it, and his fingers found a photograph, folded in half. He opened it, and the world trembled. A picture of him leaning over a woman in a silk robe and another man in a suit. The image caught as if the camera itself had tripped in the moment of betrayal. A laugh that was not a laugh escaped his lips and then turned into a sound like breaking glass. Rosa reached for his arm, and he jerked away, the suitcase falling open and shirts tumbling like white flags. Someone on the street below honked 2 times, sharp and impatient, but that noise was now irrelevant under the sudden thunder inside the house. "Who is she?" Rosa whispered, more to herself than to him. Victor grabbed the photograph as if it were a live thing. His voice was small and unfamiliar. "I thought it was private." Her hands hovered near his sleeve, a reflexive motion trained by years of folding and polishing. He looked at her, eyes dark and raw. "I keep nothing private anymore, Rosa," he said. "Not after the board, not after the papers." The bed creaked as if the building itself were trying to speak. A vase tipped, a thin crack of ceramic, then silence. The scent of jasmine mingled with cigarette smoke that had absorbed into the upholstery months ago, a memory of a night he could not now place. Above them, behind a closed door, the person who had been in that photograph slept, with a phone glowing faintly on the nightstand. The house seemed to hold its breath. The first confrontation stretched into a slow, granular argument with a cadence neither of them expected. "You cannot let him go in there," Rosa said again, voice low and steady. "If you go up, you will see things you cannot unsee. You will do things you can't undo." Victor laughed without humor. "What do you want me to do, Rosa? Wave a white flag? Admit I am human on paper? I built this. I earned this." She shut her eyes as if to keep from watching him fall apart. "You earned numbers," she said. "You did not earn the loyalty in these walls, not when you turn your back." His hands trembled as he reached for his phone. Rain started to patter harder against the front windows. The clock ticked, and the time seemed to be counting down to two possible outcomes: confession or collapse. They argued with a precision that felt rehearsed, each sentence landing and reverberating. "You do not understand," he said. "You never had to make the choices I made." "Choices do not erase consequences," she answered. "Not for the woman in that photograph, and not for you either." A car door slammed. Outside, with a hollow, metallic echo, Victor's jaw worked as he tried to shape a sentence into something that would hold water. For a moment, his composure cracked, and he admitted, "I was afraid of being small." Rosa's hand splayed against the banister, fingertips pressing grooves into the varnish. "Afraid does not excuse betrayal," she said. The house seemed to inhale, the curtains stirring as if a draft had brushed them. He shut his eyes, the photograph crinkling in his fingers. Rosa had a way of speaking that made things blunt and visible. She was not a woman of many false consolations. "Listen to me," she said. "You are not beyond repair, but you must not run upstairs. If you go up there right now, you will break either yourself or someone else." Victor looked at the stairs as if they were a pair of black teeth. He began to climb, each step a decision, and she moved to stop him. "Please," she said. "I have cleaned this house when it was full of arguments and when it was full of laughter. Let me keep it from being full of wreckage." And in that plea was a history of doors she had locked, meals she had made, bills she had paid quietly, and 1,000 small acts that composed a life of loyalty. He paused halfway, hand on the banister, pulse visibly knocking at his throat. The rain matched his heartbeat, and the lights of passing cars painted the stair in fractured gold. The scene escalated quickly into noise and motion. He pushed past, and she grabbed his sleeve. "You will not go in there," she said, louder now. "Not without me." "Move," he said. "Get out of my way." Her grip tightened, and she smelled of lemon and old money, the cost of years spent making someone else's life pristine. He shoved, and her elbow hit the banister. She teetered, the sound of her shoe scraping like a sternum striking cedar. For a second, everything stilled, the kind of silence that comes right before a body falls. He looked at her, and for the first time in 9 years saw the person who had held his family together when his sister left, who had read to his father during chemo, who had held a hand through long nights. Guilt arrived like a cold tide. He hesitated, and that hesitation was the hinge upon which the rest of the night would turn. It was a single push that changed everything, a shove that sent Rosa stumbling backward into the foyer. Her cheek hit the edge of a low table, and the pain bloomed across her face like a map. She gasped, and the breath left her in a long, ragged exhale. Victor froze, the photograph fluttering from his fingers onto the Persian rug. The sound was small and terrible. He reached for her, and she pulled away, fingers curled, a look of fierce alarm in her eyes. "I did not mean to," he said. "I did not mean to." Tears came then, unbidden, and he moaned like someone who had lost a limb without knowing it. Rosa pressed a hand to the place where she had been struck and tasted copper on her tongue, the metallic memory of blood. The house swelled with an ache that felt like a living thing. Downstairs, a neighbor's dog barked, a thin, plaintive call that barely cut the air. Sirens arrived at that moment, far off, then closer, the urgency of tires on wet pavement. A neighbor named Lila Reed called out from below, her voice carrying up the stairwell. "Is everything all right?" she asked, stepping into the foyer in slippers. She smelled of laundry heat and lemon soap. Marco Alvarez, the driver, who had been waiting for Victor like a loyal sentinel in the car outside, rushed up the steps, rain spattering the hem of his uniform. "What happened?" he said, eyes flicking between the photograph on the rug and the two people in the foyer. His hands shook slightly. Victor looked at him like a man trapped on an island, and then around the room as if the walls themselves might answer. The house guard clicked his phone, calling emergency services, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Please tell me you are not hurt," Marco said to Rosa. Rosa tried to laugh, a short, disbelieving sound that came out as more of a cough. Her cheek was red, and there was a shallow cut along her temple. She smelled faintly of plaster dust from when she had last painted the guest room, a homely scent that now felt out of place. "I will be fine," she said, but the words were thin. She had learned to minimize pain, to press through injuries for the sake of schedules and dignity. On the phone, she listed her symptoms in short, practical phrases, the way someone trained to talk with hospital intake would. A neighbor, Teddy Chin, who managed a nearby bodega and had grown fond of Rosa over years of lending her change, stood with his arms folded and watched with a worried frown. Jenna Morris, an investigative journalist who had been at Victor's company for weeks trying to track board minutes and offshore accounts, waited outside with a press pass burning like a small sun in her pocket. She smelled of cold espresso and urgency. An ambulance arrived with a dull chorus of fluorescent lights and the squeak of rubber boots. EMTs, efficient and blunt, moved through the townhouse like practiced medics in a theater. Dr. Susan Park, later the ER physician on call that night, would later describe the scene as clinical chaos wrapped in private calamity. They checked Rosa, her pulse, the cut, her pupils. The ambulance doors closed and the gurney shuddered as they put her in. Victor squeezed his hands over the photograph until the edges bowed. He whispered something to himself that sounded like an apology and then like an accusation. Marco followed them to the hospital, keys still warm in his palm. He drove with a careful, relentless focus, tires hissing against wet asphalt, radio muted. In the rearview mirror, Victor watched the lane lines slide by, each stripe a thin piece of future he had not yet decided how to navigate. At the hospital, the fluorescent lights smelled of antiseptic and endless waiting. The intake area was awash of muted tones and the beeping of monitors from rooms unseen. Dr. Susan Parks sat with a pen behind her ear and eyes that moved with a humane efficiency. Nurse Omar Ruiz greeted Rosa with a calm voice as they transferred her to a bed, a towel pressed to the shallow wound. "You are in the right place," Omar said. His hands were quick and precise. He was small and quick, with the steady smile of a man who had comforted countless strangers. He called an imaging tech and ordered a CT scan for a possible concussion because she had hit her head. The sounds of the emergency room became a soundtrack, rubber soles against tile, the rustle of paper gowns, the distant wail of another siren. Victor hovered at the window of the triage room like someone watching a globe spin. The heaviness in his chest felt physical. A nurse, later named by reporters as Jenna because of a mistake on the intake form, wrote down Rosa's account in ink that bled a little onto the edges. She described the fall, the push, and Victor's hand. Dr. Park listened with a face that was composed but not cold. "We will take care of you," she said, and there was authority in the syllables. The CT came back clear, no fracture, only a mild concussion and a bruise. The legal portions of the night began even as the medical softened. Officer Helen Grant from the local precinct interviewed those present in a small fluorescent room. She had a notebook and a voice that made people answer directly. "Did you witness an assault?" she asked Victor and Rosa and neighbors in turn. Marco described how he had seen a scuffle. Teddy gave a terse statement. The hospital filled with paper and signatures like leaves. Rosa signed with careful handwriting and the ink trembled. Backstory for Victor Aldridge. He was born in a small factory town to a mother who cleaned offices and a father who worked the night shift in a metal shop. He learned early that the world responded to currency and to the cadence of confidence. In college, he studied finance, his days mapped out in spreadsheets, his nights spent at internships where he polished shoes for men who never saw how hard he worked. A scholarship, a loan, a mix of grit and an unforgiving hunger brought him to the top of a company he would later transform into an empire of investments and real estate. He married young to a woman who at first seemed part of the architecture of success, elegant at dinners, poised on panels. Then his first company failed, and he learned the cold algebra of layoffs, the calculus of cutting costs to save a balance sheet. His rise cost him friendships, vacations, a few tender parts of himself. He learned to speak in projections and to hide a trembling chest behind boardroom windows. The photograph that had fallen from his hand was a geometry of a life he had tried to build, a private calculus that now unraveled. He had lost a brother to an accident years ago, and that loss had turned the parameter of his decisions into something harder. He often worked through nights with takeout boxes and an old desk lamp, the city lights providing a cold kind of company. Victor believed that stability meant making the smallest possible errors and never looking back. He gave to charities to ease a conscience worn thin by hard choices. The net of his life was spangled with properties and titles, but also with an aching loneliness he seldom admitted. The pattern of his intimate life was discreet and compartmentalized. He trusted a small circle and kept the rest at a tidy distance. That distant housekeeper, Rosa, had been part of those distances and also, paradoxically, part of his few anchors. The discovery of a photograph that contradicted his version of control was not merely a revelation of infidelity. It was a rupture in the model he used to navigate relationships, both personal and corporate. Backstory for Rosa Morales. She had grown up in a coastal village where her family tended a tiny grocery store, and the smell of salt and onions formed the background music of childhood. As a girl, she learned to fold shirts with meticulous care from her mother, who would say that the way you fold a shirt reveals how you will hold your life. Rosa worked in kitchens and at laundries, learned how to iron collars until the creases were symmetrical, and moved to the city at 19 with a suitcase and a stack of recipes. She took work where she could find it and eventually found steady employment with the Aldridge family. There she found a place that respected the rituals of care, a home where small acts mattered. She read aloud to Victor's father when chemo made him sleep. She kept a secret key for nights when the family was away and the house needed tending. And she learned the names of plants and the right time to water them. Loyalty for her was not a transaction, but a muscle she had strengthened through years of patient devotion. Rosa had also known loss. Her sister had left home with a young child and never called much. There were letters that arrived occasionally with stamps from distant cities, each one a small apology. Rosa had paid for surgeries and for school supplies with money she had tucked away in a cookie tin. She prided herself on resilience and had been the quiet backbone of many small recoveries, including the Aldridge families. Her dreams were modest: a small apartment above a storefront, a place to sleep without the steady thrum of anxiety. Perhaps one day a visit back to the coastal village where the air smelled of sea and cilantro. She kept photographs of family in a locket and had a secret habit of humming an old lullaby when the house was still. The decision to stand between Victor and the upstairs room was not theatrical. It was consistent with a lifetime of choosing to hold things together even when it cost pain. At approximately 30% into this story, after the first great rupture and before the full public cascade, we need to pause and ask you to engage. If you felt the same tightness in your chest that came when Rosa stopped Victor on the stairs, please tell us in the comments. Start your comment with the phrase, "I saw," and then describe, in one sentence, a time you witnessed a secret change of family. Your comment matters because it builds a community of people who saw hard things and survived. We read these stories and sometimes they guide the choices we make in future episodes. Did you ever stop someone from doing something irreversible? Did you ever hold a thin, trembling hand in a foyer under the weather of truth? We want to know. Your voice helps others understand that they are not alone. Now, we will move on to the hospital, the legal steps, and a confrontation that will become public. The interview room at the precinct was small and smelled faintly of old coffee and disinfectant. Officer Helen Grant wrote notes with precise strokes. Victor sat with a corporate lawyer on his left, Tom Beckett, a man in a gray suit whose briefcase was an extension of his arm. Tom had advised Victor on many difficult matters, and his presence was a constant reminder of how strategy softens scandal. "We are not here to vilify," Tom said, voice measured. "We are here to understand what occurred." Victor's answers were clipped. He denied intent, he explained stress, he admitted to a lapse but refused to call it assault. Rosa, sitting across from him under a fluorescent light that flattened her features, described the push in quiet, steady language. "He shoved me," she said. "I hit the table." Her statement was precise, the way a person trained in making lists speaks. Officer Grant asked whether there had been previous incidents. Rosa said no. Marco Alvarez testified on behalf of Victor in a way that surprised no one and pleased some. Teddy and Layla offered statements that were sympathetic but not definitive. Jenna Morris, the journalist, had lingered outside the precinct doors, taking notes through a glass that fogged with her breath. News traveled fast. Jenna filed a piece that evening, careful but with a headline that suggested more. "Billionaire involved in domestic altercation at Fifth Avenue townhouse." The article rained small waves across social media. Comments poured in with assumptions and judgments, and a few with empathy. The story attracted a reporter from a morning show that relished human conflict and polished guilt. Victor watched his name pop across screens and felt something unfamiliar, a small fracture of panic combined with a stubborn anger. "This is private," he said to Tom. "This is being taken and made into fodder." Tom, practiced in crisis management, recommended a quiet statement, a minor apology, and an emphasis on medical facts. "We can handle this," he said. "We will control the narrative." Jenna Morris, who had a nose for documents, began to dig through public records and found traces of an acquisition that had left people displaced and a foundation donation that had been used as a veil for a corporate restructuring. She smelled a story and knew the mechanics of scandal. Rosa, whose name was also now circulating in a way she had never anticipated, sat with Nurse Omar and held a cup of tea that tasted like chamomile and ash. The early public reaction split along familiar lines. Fans of Victor's philanthropic profile rushed to defend the empire he represented, citing job creation and investment returns. Critics pointed to the photograph Jenna had seen and teased in her notes, a picture surely to be used if the narrative shifted. Counsel advised caution. Tom Beckett arranged a press release that emphasized remorse and a need for privacy during recovery. Marcus White, a PR consultant who had helped other high-net-worth clients before, appeared with carefully measured language. He suggested a staged interview where Victor could show contrition and humanize himself in a way that would soften public opinion. "We will make him vulnerable on his own terms," Marcus said. "We will show the part of the man that people like to root for." Rosa received messages offering support and, in some corners, suspicion. A small donation page started by a neighbor raised a few $100s for her medical expenses in less than a day. The hospital visit became a pivot point not only for injury but for moral reckoning. Victor visited Rosa in a chair pushed close to her bed, the light in the room warm and forgiving. He sat awkwardly, like a man trying on a garment he had not expected to wear. "I am sorry," he said, the words both small and enormous. He had never been compelled to say those words in public before. Rosa looked at him, the bruise faint under the skin now, and then away at a wall calendar. "Sorry is a word you can buy with anything," she said. "It is not what keeps a house from breaking." Victor's voice dropped. "I will make it right," he promised. "I will step back from the company if that is what it takes." He meant it, and in that meaning, there was an echo of the man who had once protected his family from the ripple effects of business decisions. "You are offering a headline," she said. "I need stability." The nurse, Omar, adjusted a blanket. Dr. Park advised rest and a follow-up. The legal process continued quietly in the background. A board meeting at Victor's company convened under a cloud. Tom Beckett explained the need for damage control to the directors, and Marcus White laid out a plan involving a statement, a charity event, and a short sabbatical for Victor. Jenna Morris continued to dig and discovered a thread that linked company restructuring to evicted tenants in a small Midwestern town. A record smear like this was lethal to reputation. Jenna's editor assigned her to keep pushing. Public opinion swelled, and a few large investors expressed concern. Victor sat in a glassed conference room and watched the numbers on his tablet dip, and he felt a new, precise terror. He had navigated markets in crisis before, but he had not anticipated the personal spiral into which one photograph could unhinge him. At home, the housekeeper role in his life now felt like an axis. The reconstruction phase started with small, symbolic acts. Victor chose to hand Rosa a check for her medical expenses and an offer to pay for a rehabilitation therapist for her, work that would support her recovery in body and in trust. He hired a counselor for himself and began to attend sessions with a thin, brittle hope. He invited Rosa to a meeting in the library, a room lined with books with leather spines that smelled faintly of dust and citrus. There, he asked her if she would consider staying, not as a subordinate, but as a partner in the household in a new way. "You have kept this place running," he said. "Would you allow me to support you in return?" She looked at him, measuring, remembering years of folded sheets and secret recipes. "What do you want me to do?" she asked. "Tell me," he replied. They spoke in long, careful exchanges that felt almost like negotiations of a different order. He proposed the salary increase, health benefits for her family, and a written role that made expectations clear. She proposed a modest apartment in the building above the bodega where Teddy worked, a guarantee for her sister about school fees, and time off to return to the coastal village once a year. Those were practicalities that also served as atonements. Layla Reed helped Rosa choose the small apartment, and Marco Alvarez arranged moving boxes with a deliberateness that felt like caring performed through action. Tom drafted contractual documents that read like a workplace agreement, yet felt like tiny admissions that change was possible. The house, which had once been a stage for Victor's performances, began to feel in tiny moments like a place where two lives might be negotiated without losing dignity. Victor stopped taking late evening calls from investors and delegated more to a trusted COO, Caroline Vega, who began to handle the day-to-day. She smelled of citrus and iron and introduced tighter governance to the empire. Caroline's presence eased some board anxieties because she had a reputation for steady hands. Yet the public aspect of the scandal could not be contained by private apologies and contractual fairness. Jenna Morris published a profile that linked the photograph to a weekend retreat where Victor had been involved with a consultant and a board member's spouse. The piece was careful, full of documents and unattributed sources, but it blew the story wide open. The company's stock wavered, and the board demanded transparency or a change at the top. Victor faced a choice: fight the narrative and burn more bridges, or step away and let repair begin. He chose the latter. He tendered his resignation to the board with a letter that read like a man returning small things to the world, an acknowledgement of fallibility and an offer to fund a legacy project. The board accepted, and the immediate financial unrest began to settle as markets reacted to the news with a mixture of relief and curiosity. The move was both a strategic retreat and a moral turning. 3 moments of acute tension followed, each folding memory into decision. The first was the private confrontation between Victor and the other man in the photograph. They met in a conference room with shades drawn. The man, an advisor named Elliot Price, opened with a brittle smile. "This is messy," Elliot said. "We can manage it." Victor closed his eyes and saw his brother's funeral and the factory floor of his childhood. The memory was a violent pressure, a reason he had built walls. He could feel his hands clench. The second moment arrived when Rosa's sister called to say she had been offered a scholarship but lacked funds for housing. Rosa sat on a stool in the kitchen and felt the old pattern of caretaking rise inside her like a tide. She could either move back to a small town or accept the city with its contradictions. The third moment came when a morning show host asked Victor, live on air, whether he had ever used company resources for private purposes. His silence stretched. He answered haltingly and then with a firmness he had never known before, and confessed to bad choices but promised restitution. Each moment closed with a distinctive sensory punctuation: the taste of coffee gone cold, the squeal of a chair dragged back, the sting of fluorescent lights. Legal and medical procedures were explained in clear terms for public consumption. The police filed an incident report that documented the assault claim and referred it to a county prosecutor who would decide on charges. Victor's legal team negotiated a quiet settlement for Rosa that included compensation and a clause for community service by Victor for a foundation supporting displaced workers. From a medical perspective, Rosa received a full neurological evaluation, a CT scan that had been clear, and a referral to outpatient therapy for concussion-related symptoms and counseling for emotional trauma. The documents used clinical terms like contusion, mild traumatic brain injury, and concussion protocol, and were explained in plain language to the public so they could understand the sequence and the safeguards. Dr. Park later spoke at length about concussion symptoms and the need to recognize emotional trauma when physical injuries appear minor. As the media storm intensified, allies and adversaries formed a cast around the central two. Jenna ran follow-ups and found a ledger entry that suggested Victor had used a foundation donation to smooth over a development deal, a move that caused small communities to close stores. Tom Beckett worked to contain the damage and negotiated with the newspapers for context. Marcus White coached Victor on how to speak with candor and humility. Caroline Vega began implementing more transparent policies at the company and arranged for a town hall in one affected community. Teddy Chen started a small fundraiser that turned into a community program offering scholarships. Officer Helen Grant filed a complete and careful report. Marco and Layla emerged as steadfast witnesses who helped verify timelines. Nurse Omar reached out to Rosa with resources for counseling and legal aid. Jenna received tips and documents from an anonymous source who signed emails with the name archivist. The middle months became a chronological exercise in repair and public relations. Victor created a restitution fund of $5 million earmarked for communities affected by the company's development decisions. The board accepted his resignation and appointed Caroline as interim CEO with a mandate to pursue ethical restructuring. Rosa received the settlement funds and a formal apology from Victor in front of a small group that included her sister and Teddy. They had a modest ceremony in the library of the townhouse where books smelled of dust and lemon and where Victor read a short statement, voice steady. "I failed to live up to my own promises," he said. "I will spend what I have to make amends. I will step back and do the hard work." The press covered it not as a spectacle, but as a necessary, if imperfect, step toward accountability. After the immediate crisis came the slow work of rebuilding. Victor enrolled in counseling focused on accountability and systemic impact. He began to meet with displaced community leaders and arranged for grants to small businesses. Rosa found a support group and began to take classes at night, studying bookkeeping and the basics of small enterprise management, something she had always wanted to do in case she one day opened her own small grocery or bakery. Marco Alvarez kept working as a driver, but also volunteered at the community center funded by Victor. Layla became an advocate, organizing neighbors and writing op-eds about community responsibility. Jenna continued to investigate but also wrote about the possibility of change. Each person named moved from reaction into action in ways that felt like growth rather than mere damage control. Reconstruction at home was a literal cleaning out of rooms and a symbolic clearing of debts. They sold one property and donated a portion of the proceeds to build affordable housing in a neighborhood affected by prior developments. Victor relinquished several seats on boards and restructured his ownership stakes so that a community trust had a voice. He learned to listen without a need to immediately fix. Rosa started her small apartment above Teddy's bodega and opened a modest evening class teaching people how to prepare traditional dishes from her village. She kept a small jar of lemon cleaner on her kitchen shelf, a token of routine and care. Their dynamic evolved into something quieter and more honest. He learned to schedule check-ins with the employees whose livelihoods depended on decisions he had once made alone. Her life widened in small, incremental ways. Epilogue, 1 month later. 1 month after the confrontation, the physical bruises had faded and meetings had multiplied. Rosa had been home for 3 weeks, attending outpatient therapy twice a week and speaking with a counselor about boundaries and trust. Her cut had left a small crescent scar that she pressed her thumb over sometimes when thinking. The settlement check had been cashed and put into a savings account labeled for family needs and for returning to her coastal village once a year. Victor had announced on a company memo that he would take a leave of absence and that Caroline Vega would step up while a third-party audit of past acquisitions would launch. The audit was small at first, composed of 3 retired professors of urban planning and an attorney recommended by Tom, who promised independence. There were meetings with community representatives arranged by Marcus White, and Victor attended 2 of them, listening more than speaking. The press cycle softened from speculation to scrutiny and then to cautious commentary. Rosa received a bouquet of flowers from a neighbor and a handwritten note from Teddy that read, "You are stronger than you think." Small acts of normal life, groceries bought, bill payments made, the small rhythms of dawn tea and evening sleep returned. Epilogue, 3 months later. At 3 months, the repairs had started to show structural change. The independent audit released a preliminary report identifying areas where the company had prioritized short-term profit over community stability and recommended policy changes and restitution mechanisms. Caroline implemented a new community advisory board and appointed 3 locals to lead its recommendations. Victor had contributed $5 million to a restitution fund and begun a series of community meetings with a transparent public ledger available online. Rosa had completed a short course in bookkeeping and was teaching 2 nights a week at the community center, a modest class of 8 people eager to learn skills to manage micro-businesses. Her relationship with her sister had mended enough that they were planning a visit back to the coastal village for the holidays. Marco had organized a neighborhood safety initiative after speaking with Officer Grant and had begun to volunteer at the center on weekends. Jenna Morris published a follow-up that acknowledged movement while still probing the depth of change. The public had started to ask for proof of lasting transformation rather than quick apologies. Conversations at dinner tables and in comment sections now focused on policy, not just personalities. Epilogue, 6 months later. At 6 months, the arc of change had deepened into systems and habits. The company, under Caroline's interim leadership, adopted a community-first policy that required impact assessments before any major redevelopment. The restitution fund had allocated $2 million to small business grants and $1 million to affordable housing projects in 3 affected neighborhoods, with a transparent board including local residents. Victor had formally resigned his seat and remained on a small advisory panel without voting rights, a symbolic step toward accountability. He spent his days in counseling, in community work, and in learning the mechanics of local economies from people he had once overlooked. Rosa opened a small daytime shop that sold traditional foods and sold out its first week, employing 2 neighbors and donating small amounts to a fund supporting displaced workers. Her life was steadier and clearer, with the added dignity of financial security and the joy of teaching. Teddy's fundraiser had evolved into a scholarship program that assisted 10 students in its first cycle. Public sentiment had shifted from frenzy to cautious optimism as more concrete numbers and names backed the narrative of repair. Victor and Rosa no longer stood on opposite sides of a FOIA crisis. They had formed an uneasy, practical alliance built on reparative acts, mutual respect, and small quotidian habits that kept promises visible. The final months taught them both that lealtad is complicated and not always pure, that betrayal can be a mirror revealing fault lines, and that rebuilding requires more than money. It requires sustained presence, accountability, and the willingness to cede power where necessary. The twist no one expected was not a grand revelation about secret affairs alone, but the slow discovery that the person who stood in front of Victor to stop him from going upstairs had a moral authority grounded in years of care. She had foiled his instinct to run, and in doing so had forced him into a reckoning that changed not just his life, but the policies and people around him. The house was cleared of secrecy. In closing, the door that began all of this now stood closed with a lock that would not be opened lightly. Consequences were concrete, with funds allocated and policies changed, and a community slowly piecing together what had been broken. Rosa kept a small jar of lemon cleaner on her new kitchen counter as a reminder that cleanliness and care matter. Victor signed papers that transferred control and gave voice to people he had once reduced to footnotes. Rosa continued to cook, to teach, to stitch small pieces of living into a broader fabric. There was a promise that felt practical rather than theatrical, a list of names in a ledger, a monthly community check-in, a scholarship with recipients already named. If you watched this and felt something, consider subscribing and joining a community that watches, that cares, and that insists on repair when power causes harm. When truth finally breathes, there is room to rebuild.